All right, and we are live. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Endless Report here. This is episode 39, and I am your host, Tony, as always. We actually got quite a bit of news this week. Wasn't sure, given, beginning of the year here, a bit of a lull earlier in the week. I was wondering maybe it might not have enough for a show. And then Thursday, Friday, we got a lot of news stories that kicked in at the end of the week here. So thankfully, a lot of interesting stuff to talk about today. First, notably, as always, we kind of talk about what's releasing this week, what's kind of current. Nothing in terms of really big game releases up until kind of the end of January. Once we see, like we saw last week on the show, that whole docket coming up in January and February. But around January 20th, 25th, we're going to see some releases. Next week, we'll talk about that. But for now, we do at least have the HBO The Last of Us series premiering this weekend. So that's pretty exciting. We've talked about that pretty much the last 2-3 episodes, probably leading up to the premieres and all the news articles we've heard about, the story. We just heard last week or so that it's going to be the entire, first video game in the first season. So very excited to see that. And I will say, this week we did get all of these reviews that came in from that premiere. So I did think it would be noteworthy just to show that for a moment with our, current releases this week, as we usually do on the docket. So as I pull that up, you can see here, this is just a Forbes article kind of cataloging, the reviews are in. And of course, as you see in the headline, they are stellar, as said by Forbes here. I've personally seen a lot of reviews. I haven't read too much in depth on them because I don't really want to spoil the show too much for myself. But from what I've had heard, if you're a fan of the game, it seems like there's plenty of surprises still in store. Fans of the game have said that they loved it. They also were on the edge of their seat and weren't expecting certain things and still came out loving, the story and still thinking it represented, the game's story in a different medium in a really great way. So I've heard a lot of great stuff like that. I've seen website articles from IGN and GameSpot and the typical game article websites we read from here. I've seen from obviously like the Hollywood Reporter and things like that. Typical Hollywood TV show review websites and the like. And everyone across the board, whether they're a video game fan or not, whether they have history of The Last of Us or not, it seems like it's getting a lot of great press. So obviously, I'm a fan of the game series. I've been pretty excited for this show. So that all sounds great to me going into the weekend. I'll probably be watching on Sunday. We'll see if I have time on Sunday night or Monday, but I'll definitely be watching sometime this weekend and excited for that. But not really anything to say on that. I just wanted to give it one last little send off on that show before it starts airing, since we've been covering that for a year or so now. And I would be, remiss here to not include that on the weekend it's launching. But that being said, nothing really, unfortunately, new in terms of new games, launching this week, as I said. But we will get more in the coming weeks, that's for sure. So that being said, we are probably going to move on here to our next article really briefly as I move over. And this is actually the article that I threw up on our thumbnail. This is the biggest story of the week, for sure. Something we've been talking about the end of last year and thankfully was true. This has been a rumor for some time. And that is, of course, this new Xbox event, this developer direct, as they're calling it. So I bring this up on Twitter here. This is via Jez Corden, who's been breaking a lot of news recently. This was first revealed by him as kind of a rumor. He put this out on his Twitter, this Windows Central article, which I'll now pull up the article he wrote as well. I have it right here. And essentially, this was earlier this week before it was announced, and nothing here, this was unofficial at the time, but nothing here was incorrect. This was exactly what was happening. And it was, of course, that Xbox Games is having a showcase on the horizon. I said this a lot during the fall of our last Endless Reports, over the last year or so. I've been dying for another PlayStation or Xbox showcase. So now we finally have Xbox jumping back into the arena here with a ton of stuff to show. Of course, the big question with them this year is, of course, Starfield. We've heard some rumors that's coming later in the year, but what we've got from this, news blast here, and I'll probably since this was just a rumor breaking there earlier in the week, I'll probably just show you the official announcement as well. Anyway. And the official event announcement here, this is courtesy of IGN, just recapping what Xbox had announced. We are getting news on pretty much everything else on the docket besides Starfield beforehand. So that includes, of course, Minecraft Legends, which a lot of people are excited for. That looks really cool, as well as Forza Motorsport. Not to be confused with Forza Horizon, that series. Forza Motorsport is the serious, more like sim racing, analogous with Gran Turismo, kind of the more sim, angle of the Forza series. That being said, we actually do have some other Forza news you may see there on the docket. Actually, it might be a little hidden there on the docket, but we'll have that coming up next, just to keep that in mind. But that being said, the new Forza Motorsport is going to be there, as well as, of course, Redfall, as you may have seen on the thumbnail. That's, of course, the other game coming from Bethesda Softworks. not to be confused with Bethesda Game Studios, who's working on Starfield and of course is known for the Elder Scrolls and Skyrim and Fallout series. This is actually coming from Arcane, who you may know, who has worked on Deathloop, the Dishonored series, some other titles there. So very interesting stuff coming from Redfall. We've seen a lot of actually newer trailers over the last, I want to say, fall, summer 2022. But I will say it has been kind of flying under the radar, unfortunately. There's been a lot of other buzz with Xbox at the moment. And I do feel like Redfall definitely needs its time in the spotlight. And I think that's going to be at this showcase. I feel like it may get one of the bigger, reveals here, bigger, gameplay demos. We've already seen quite a bit of trailers and some shorter gameplay segments from that game. It seems like it's really close on the horizon. I know Minecraft Legends, I know Forza Motorsport are within the next few months here as well, as Redfall. I'm assuming they're all within Q1 and Q2. And the reason I say that is because back, I want to say almost a year ago on that last summer, Xbox showcase they did state, or this is maybe even earlier 2022, forgive me for my lack of memory here. They stated that everything they showed in that showcase will be coming out in the next 12 months, bearing any delays or anything like that, not happening. And so far they've been able to stick, pretty closely to that promise. I don't think there's been any real drops there in terms of games that are being really, significantly delayed or have dropped from that promise. So it seems like everything here is planned for the first half of the year. Starfield is very strongly being implied that it may be summer. I think June. I think June is really the strongest month everybody's kind of talking about right now. But we're going to have to see what happens here. But either way, all that being said, this is obviously, exciting for Xbox. It was a tough 2023, to put it lightly. Unfortunately, a lot of delays. This is for everybody last year, especially, unfortunately, I think Xbox really had a tough time with it. Some of their bigger titles like Starfield, like some expansions, like some things we wanted. They did have Halo, got that winter updated. I think Forge mode, Halo Infinite is having a little bit of a resurgence. We talked about that on the show. But in terms of new, exclusive games, it has not been the year of Xbox in 2022. 2023 seems like it could be more so, a year of Xbox that I think they've had in almost a decade. I really look back, and I'm not sure there's been a lineup like this for them in a long time. And a lot of these games in this lineup were games that we've been talking about for a while as well, that have all just kind of been, unfortunately, continue to be worked on. And fortunately, fortunately, they are, for the better. And these games are going to come out for the better due to those delays, of course. But it has been some time. We've been waiting for a while. We've talked about this, of course, a ton on the show, so I won't go too much deeper into that conversation. But I'm super excited to see more from Xbox this year. Obviously, I'm a big Bethesda fan as well, so I'm definitely excited for Starfield later on. That's going to get its own showcase, apparently. So that'll be at the Developer Direct. You're not going to see that this month. But obviously, the most important thing here is, when is this Developer Direct? Of course, it's at the end of the month here, end of January. So you don't have to wait too long. I believe not next week, but the week after that is January 25th. So I believe that is, I want to say that's a Tuesday or Wednesday. Let me look here quick on my calendar here. That's a Wednesday. So not a week from now, but 2 weeks from now, we're going to get that Xbox showcase. Again, you're going to get to see Redfall, Forza, Minecraft Legends, maybe some other stuff we don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. But no Starfield. Keep that in mind. It's going to get its own full showcase sometime in the next few months, I'm assuming, given that, it's going to be probably Q2. Definitely not Q1. Maybe Q2, maybe Q3. But I'm thinking Q2 sometime in June-ish, around there. Definitely sounds like a strong bet for Starfield. But who knows? That's just me, my conjecture right now. But that's what I'm thinking. That being said, speaking of Forza Motorsport, this is actually not directly, on the Forza Motorsport team, but on the Forza Horizon team, we actually had some switch ups here. So speaking on that, I'm going to pull this article up on my screen here, and I'll move that over for you guys. This is actually a new announcement of a new game studio. So known as Maverick Games. This is a brand new studio being developed by former Forza Horizon developers here. These are executives, these are high level, executives on the Forza Horizon team who have formed their own, studio now. I guess, obviously they have worked together, at length on the Forza Horizon series. They've probably, they have maybe have some new ideas, and they are looking to form a new studio together here. So just to go over this here, this fresh team is led by Playground veterans and Forza Horizon 5 creative director Mike Brown, with work already underway on a new premium open world game for consoles and PC. Very interesting. So we don't know, is this another racing game? Is this the reason I asked that is because Playground Games, we do know, is still apparently working on that not Forza, that Fable reboot. We're not sure what's happening with that series. Obviously, if you're aware of Fable, it's a fantasy RPG series, not a racing game whatsoever. Of course, this team here has now left Playground Games, the Forza developers, so they're not currently working on that or Fable or anything like that anymore. But who knows here what they've branched out on? We see it's a premium open world game. Is that another open world Forza type racing game? Is it another something completely different? We don't exactly know. That's what's interesting, and it's always exciting or interesting to see what can come from new studios. So I think it's a very interesting story this week. That being said, we did mention Mike Brown, who is a creative director on Forza Horizon 5, who is now leading at the studio, as well as five other, former Playground staff here at Maverick, and that includes Tom Butcher, who is a lead producer at Playground, who's now the studio's executive producer here at Maverick Games. We have Matt Craven, who is a technical director at Playground, is now chief technical officer, CTO there. We have Gareth Harwood, a technical art director, is now Maverick's content director, and Fraser Stachin, excuse me if I mispronounced that, an audio director at Playground, now owns the same post and audio director, as well as does Penn Penrose as former Playground art director. So that there you have it. Not much else to share there in terms of the details and what they're working on here, exactly what's going to happen next for Maverick Games. That being said, very interesting. Obviously a lot of lead creatives there over from Playground. So the question is here, not only what comes from Maverick Games now, how does Playground Games react to this? Maybe obviously it's only there are 6 employees here. That being said, it's obviously an entire studio still a Playground. That being said, there's obviously when you have a lot of lead creative, directors and creatives from the studio, exit like this, there probably is a bit of restructuring there, and maybe especially for the future of the Forza Horizon series, especially obviously Forza Motorsport seems a bit on its own, path there. I'm not sure how connected those two series are with development. I'm sure they do share a good amount of resources, given it's the same studio, it's the same Forza series, but the Motorsport and Horizon, releases have always been very, different in certain ways. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how Playground Games, maybe bounces back from this. What comes next with the Horizon series? What comes next from Fable from them if they're going to continue the Horizon series? Maybe they branch Forza into just one single, series going forward. There's a lot of questions that maybe arise from here, and I don't really have the answers because we're gonna have to wait and see. But definitely a lot to think about there. And I mean, there's a few things that are kind of, churning my head, the gears there of like, what comes next here? Do they continue these two different Forza, branches? I guess it really depends. And maybe that's what they're deciding right now. Who knows? But that being said, very interesting, and we'll have to see what comes next for Maverick Games. But on that end, that's very exciting. That being said, I do want to move on now to our next story. As I pull over my docket here, we are going to cover, unfortunately, some more delays here, some more bad news coming from Ubisoft. So all right. So sorry about that, guys. Not sure where that cut off, if you heard me in the interim there, but unfortunately, YouTube's stream cut out. We had a little bit of server timeout there, so I was in the dark a bit. It was just, that turning symbol. I wasn't sure where, I cut off there. If you guys were hearing me, so apologies for the lapse in connection. I didn't want to end the stream because I didn't want to have to reset everything there. So you might have seen a little buffering. I got that be right back screen up, but hopefully, we're still here. You're live with me now. Looks like that all fixed. I want to make sure I'm the audio. We are okay. So all sounds good now. Apologies for the inconvenience there. Looks like the stream server just timed out, but we're back. I almost thought I lost my internet connection. I got a little worried there because we had some issues with the fiber optics recently, but we're all good. So we're back on target here. We're gonna get back into the news. So no worries there. Hopefully y'all can hear me again. Again, apologies for that delay with the little jump in the stream, but that's all right. We're still back on the docket here. As I was saying, I believe we were just getting started with this Ubisoft story anyway, so not, I wasn't too deep into the story or anything like that. We didn't miss much here. That being said, unfortunately, this is not the best news here coming out of Ubisoft this week. So I believe if you guys have been keeping up with the show, a few months back, we had reported on a similar story. They first announced that last year they unfortunately had to cancel, I believe, 3 or 4 unannounced game projects around last fall, maybe late last summer. They also had to delay Skull and Bones, a longtime project that's kind of been on the, really, really struggling to get released for many years now. It's had a very long development cycle. I believe there's actually some legal agreements in terms of with some, investors and things like that, where I think they are contractually still obligated to release that game, and maybe, to be honest, in my opinion, may have canceled that a long time ago if that weren't the case. There are some different implications there. That being said, this unfortunate news again. Ubisoft, and it looks like it's the same story. That was actually a few months ago. Ubisoft now has canceled 3 more unannounced games that we didn't even know about yet. We completely canceled those projects that obviously probably had a lot of investment already going into them, and is also delayed Skull and Bones for the 6th time, which is really tough to hear. Especially if you've been looking forward to Skull and Bones, maybe not if you're just an Ubisoft fan in general or been following the story. We've covered this back, I want to say 10 episodes ago, 20 episodes ago, and I'm not even exaggerating. There have probably been 2 or 3 Skull and Bones delays we've covered on the show since I started the Endless Report. So it's not, a story that's super new to me. I think we kind of joked a bit. It was a little bit of a jest last time that, hopefully it's coming out that next time in February or January. It was supposed to come out this year. We were kind of like, it has to be that time. Apparently still is not. I'm very sorry to hear that. Unfortunately, I don't mean to poke fun or anything like that. Obviously, delayed game, hoping that, that gives them more time here to improve the development and get the best game out possible. That being said, unfortunately, this game has had a lot of issues over the years in development. I really hope, again, I struggle to see, maybe even to be honest, how they're going to, maybe market and get back to, a larger release when this does eventually come out. Because even though this release was imminent, it was clear that maybe a delay was, seemed, given there was not a lot of, launch coverage, not a lot of, more news coming out, unfortunately, here. But that being said, again, not the most exciting news here for Ubisoft, and that brings in a lot of questions from the industry here. We've seen a lot of people, especially industry insiders, both games journalists, people who have followed these acquisitions in the games industry for a long time, are all talking, when does the last shoe drop here? When's the last straw for Ubisoft? Is anyone looking to acquire Ubisoft? That's the kind of discussions we're seeing on Twitter now. We saw it with companies like Bungie, with Bethesda, with Activision, even with before a lot of these major acquisitions. So I'm not saying that just because people are saying it might happen means it will, but obviously Ubisoft is not in the best spot here. We did hear, actually, I believe Yves Guillemot, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing his name there. The president of Ubisoft had sent out a letter, I believe, to staff telling them that 2023 is a crucial year, and that it's going to count on them this year to really keep Ubisoft in the running and to be successful. It is the most crucial year they've had in a very long time. That being said, unfortunately, I think a lot of what has happened with Ubisoft over the past few years in terms of their game series and decisions they made, I'm unfortunately hoping that I'm hoping, I should say, not unfortunately, hoping that there's something different on the pipeline. Because if their strategy here is like, let's just keep doing the same things we've been doing the past few years, I think that's, hindsight's 2020 here. Who am I to be saying this? But unfortunately, I think that's what got us in this situation now. So I do think that, as much as I am I've loved Assassin's Creed as one of the first, one of the major game series that I enjoyed when I was first getting into gaming. And I think that while Assassin's Creed is their bread and butter, it's still very much something they can come out with. I think Mirage this year is going to be a big test of how well that game performs. Obviously, they have a few other titles in the works here. They also have that Avatar title on the horizon, which I don't think we should forget, which could be very interesting. We'll have to see how that title plays out. They have that Star Wars open world title, which everyone's kind of what's the word here? I guess cautiously optimistic on it. I've heard a lot of, unfortunately, some negativity, some positivity in different directions there. But I really hope if those projects can work out for the better, that could help them bounce back late 2023, given that they unfortunately do seem to be in a tough spot at the moment. That being said, of course, we've had a lot of, as I said, we had a lot of industry, journalists and people like that discussing this. We discussed, people have discussed, who will maybe try to, jump into the situation if Ubisoft doesn't succeed on their own and wants to continue on their own. Do we see someone like Embracer or Tencent or, another, maybe Microsoft or another large company look to acquire them? I'm not exactly sure what happens next there, but that does remain to be seen. Then again, fortunately, they had a bit of a lackluster performance last year with Mario and Rabbids. They said here, underperforming a bit. Unfortunately, I'm not sure where they go here in 2023, given, again, we said this with a lot of companies. A lot was delayed. A lot has been on the back burner here. There's been a lot of restructuring in the industry in general. That being said, just financially here, given the implications of their 2022 performances, Ubisoft is really, really in a crucial position to perform in 2023. So for their sakes, I really hope that they can get out of this jam that they're in right now. That being said, I'm hoping for new and more exciting stuff from Ubisoft as well. I want to see more. I'm curious to see what the future of Assassin's Creed looks like with those two announced. I shouldn't say unannounced. They are announced projects, but with no details. Want to see if they can continue to evolve these existing IPs and maybe come out with something new as well. Unfortunately, I feel like Ubisoft has maybe struggled a bit with having new IPs in the last, I hate to say it, but 5-10 years or so. I mean, we look back at what has been the core franchises, and to this day, I think they still are. Their open world formulas with Assassin's Creed and Far Cry and some other, a few other, profile, what's the word here? I'm sorry, I'm blanking there, but any IPs is what I'm trying to say. Intellectual properties. Again, it's a tough one. So I kind of at the end of what I'm trying to say here, I guess, as you can tell, kind of at a lack for words, but I really do hope that Ubisoft can bounce back here. I guess that being said, we probably are going to move on to something a little more positive, a little more exciting. But then again, we're wishing the best for Ubisoft in this coming year of 2023. So that being said, we are moving on here, as you may have saw on the docket, to a bit more on PSVR 2. Not much else to say here. I've been talking a bit about the new PSVR on the show, but it is pretty imminent. We're getting it next month. I obviously talked last week about the announcements at CES. We got that Gran Turismo announcement, which looks really, really cool, I think. And even as someone who's not a big racer, as a racing fan, game fan, I should say, I'm even considering getting a racing wheel, getting into it. Learning how to drive a little bit better. It's as funny as that sounds. Maybe on the game, you really can learn, real sim driving in those games, and it looks really exciting. That being said, we get some news here from Palmer Luckey, the original founder of the Oculus. Of course, the Oculus Rift, now owned by Meta, now known as the Meta Quest or whatever branding it's under now. It still is the original Oculus technology there. So this comes from Palmer Luckey, who of course founded the Oculus company here, and he actually got to try out PSVR 2 recently, and he said, quote, "I was blown away when I used PSVR 2 recently. The first PSVR was arguably the biggest success of the generation, and this version will do even better." So I guess take this with a grain of salt here. Again, there's no brand deal or any kind of partnership here between Palmer Luckey and Sony or anything like that. This is not a sponsored comment. That being said, coming from someone who is, people would argue one of the faces of VR, I guess is the way you would say it. Someone who has, been at the forefront of VR technology, to say that this is like groundbreaking or it blows them away. It's pretty interesting. Not much else to say there, because that's really his only comment. The article goes on here to just clarify some details for the PSVR headset. But I did just bring this up just because again, it's like I said earlier in the show today, we did have a lot of a bit of a drought this week before the last 2 days. And I saw this article and I thought, given that this is again, like I said, one of the faces of VR, I really, really am excited to see what PSVR 2 can do come next month. I'm actually going to be probably acquiring one. I did pre-order one. I've been thinking maybe, I don't know if I'm going to keep the pre-order, but I think I will. So I will report back here on the Endless Report, maybe give my thoughts briefly on one episode, like I did with the Steam Deck and some other things, for like 5-10 minutes. Maybe I'll do that as well next month once it releases. But that being said, I get excited about new technology, and although I wouldn't want to be biased here. I'm a PlayStation player, obviously. Given I'm buying this, I do have a PlayStation 5. I am a big fan of Xbox as well. I'm looking forward to a lot of what they have coming up this year as well. Like I just said, the Developer Direct, so hoping either whether it's on Xbox or PC, whatever that I play the Xbox platform on. I am a fan of both platforms here, but that being said, I think in terms of new hardware, we don't get to see that very often. Obviously the Steam Deck was very exciting this year. The Switch and the Switch Lite in the past few years in terms of handhelds and that kind of stuff. But in terms of VR, I haven't really had the opportunity, to own a lot of VR headsets myself. I had one I think that came with my Samsung Galaxy phone. It was one you put your cell phone into that came free with the phone when I first got that Galaxy, I think as the S8. And then I was very fortunate enough to take a VR and technology class during my time at college. Really, really awesome course. Got to try a lot of different VR headsets and even build VR games, which is really, really cool. That being said, it was a very short time. And in that time when I used headsets like the Steam Index, the HTC Vive, the Oculus, and I was blown away, moving from like a mobile VR headset to a PC, based VR system, like we are going to get similar to that, of course, with the console based PSVR 2, all the processing power of both the PS5 and, what's in the headset. So this is obviously there's a lot going on here. I've talked a bit about, the eye tracking technology, about the resolution, the HDR, the dual sense, haptic features here. There's been some details recently. I think we talked about this last time of how, there's gonna be some new features in the games that are gonna interact with this stuff, like the new horror, Dark Pictures anthology series. If you're aware of those horror games, they're gonna have features where there's a monster where every time you blink, it'll move around in the room and it can track your eye movements and know where you're looking, when you're blinking, and they can kind of like, strategize around you, which is a really scary concept, but it's almost like a living horror movie kind of idea the more you think about it. I'm not, I'm a little, I'm a little scared of horror games, to put it lightly. I'm not the biggest horror fan when it comes to VR. I'm not sure how much I'd enjoy that. I'd be a little squeamish maybe, but sounds really, really fascinating, really, really cool. And just the implications there, the technology, especially in any kind of first person VR game, of what that can mean for just gameplay interactions, is really, really cool. Especially like NPC interactions, if they can actually interact and see how you're reacting and seeing them. There's a lot that can go into that. Then again, that's one of those things I could just talk for, I feel like, all day if I got, interested in all those, into all these new tech improvements here. So that about does it for PSVR 2 today, but that's coming out very soon, actually, not many weeks away there. So definitely it'll be on the horizon here for the next few weeks on the show, that's for sure. That being said, we want to move back a bit actually to Microsoft as I move over our docket here. We got some new news actually on HoloLens. This is something we covered, I want to say, about a year or so ago now. It's been some time, but we have got new updates here on that deal between Microsoft and the U.S. government to buy about $400 million worth of HoloLens headsets for military use. So that being said, this deal actually did not go through. That being said, it is actually being improved on. So as we get into this here, Congress has said that the Army is not approved to make this deal and to buy these headsets at the current time because of the current limitations of the headset still. So as they said here in the report, unfortunately, they believe HoloLens is still at a point where it's not suitable for military use. They said while the headset itself may have had some real test uses and has been successful in some actual like on-site what's the word here, executions of the device, and it was able to maybe help them out strategically. They have said that afterwards there's been a lot of things like fatigue, headaches, nausea, typical things you'd hear that are issues with VR headsets on soldiers, and that's the problem here. So it's at a place where maybe it's functional enough to definitely be a useful tool for for the military, but maybe not enough to not make people sick and not be more of a hindrance in the long run. That being said, Congress here said that while they're not approving the deal between Microsoft and U.S. military, they're actually giving even more money here in order to invest in HoloLens and to improve all of these these issues and these discrepancies. So they're giving more money here to invest back into HoloLens and into improving how can we get rid of these nausea issues and things of the like. So that being said, I'm not sure exactly how many headsets here they have tested. I believe they said they got around, here we see right here, around 1,000 soldiers. I knew it was somewhere in the article I'd read before. Around 1,000 soldiers have provided feedback on around 100,000 hours of testing with previous versions. According to Bloomberg, it awarded Microsoft around 125 million to develop version 1.2, in addition to the 40 million that Congress had recently approved. So a lot, obviously a lot of money going into here. Maybe there's a lot of implications on this conversation about what this means for the future of military and world politics and technology and games crossing into those areas. Maybe a little above my pay grade there with that conversation. But that being said, I definitely think it is worth noting. Definitely interesting here. So I did want to include like the VR stories. I feel like that kind of played into each other. Well, Microsoft doesn't have a gaming VR headset on the horizon. They're definitely still working with this kind of technology in a very, very, implicative, I guess, way, you should say, here. But very interested to see what comes next to that and the future of VR and augmented reality, hopefully for the for the better and for peace and for the right reasons. But it is a very, I think, notable use of the technology that I wanted to note on the show today, even though it isn't really gaming related per se. That being said, back to some things that are a bit gaming related, we are gonna move down here. And apologies, I'm not sure if I moved the docket properly last time with that logo. That should have been on this article here. But that being said, let me just pull this up on the side. We are again talking about Microsoft, but not in terms of this deal here with the U.S. military, but back on the deal that we've been talking about for some time, and that, of course, is the Activision acquisition. So we're still here, still up in the air whether this may or may not actually happen. But we got some very big players joining the conversation here this week, and maybe not looking too hot for Microsoft in terms of this continuing criticism of them in this conversation. So as you see, of course, on screen, we have Google, of course, Google Alphabet being a very, probably the biggest other tech player that could even talk in this conversation, and NVIDIA, very interestingly, both joining the conversation and expressing their concerns to the FTC about Microsoft's deal acquiring Activision. So as Sony, as a few other companies, and some other independent, critiques have said, including even some of the FTC's own, concerns. Both, NVIDIA and Alphabet here are concerned that this deal would, isolate certain practices, would monopolize certain parts of the industry, specifically here going into game streaming. I think this is really the meat of the argument, because I think a lot of the conversation here, and especially on the show, and I feel like I've talked about this in the past, has been thrown at Call of Duty. And you've seen what Microsoft has done themselves, saying, "Oh, what's the big deal here? Sony has all these exclusive games. What's the big deal? We're just acquiring one." Like, they're just going for Call of Duty and nothing else. I've seen a lot of the conversation kind of flow that way. And it seems here that, for the right reasons, Google and NVIDIA, who both have huge, investments in cloud game streaming, obviously Stadia and NVIDIA Shield and their cloud streaming are, had better days for sure. That being said, it's clear that Alphabet Inc., Google, and NVIDIA are still very much so interested in the future of streaming and still getting back into that market. And they have expressed their concerns here alongside Sony, saying that this deal would give Microsoft an advantage on both, the Xbox Game Pass, their xCloud services, and their cloud streaming with their Azure servers and all that, would give them way too much of an advantage here in terms of having way too many high profile, IPs, having the rights to this, to this huge monster, game in the market. I don't think it's just Call of Duty on these things. Like, just to reiterate, like I said there, I do think it is just having all of the strength of Activision. Obviously, the strength of these IPs. I'm not saying they don't matter; they definitely do matter. But then you have that. You also have Xbox's, cloud streaming, their strategy going forward, what the strategy is with Xbox Game Pass, and then their ability, if they do have this acquisition, to continue with this immense size and just, buying power and studio power to eventually just, edge out the competition in terms of not leaving any room for them, whether or not that's more acquisitions or just simply having this monolithic presence that other games can't compete with. We've seen how expensive these days AAA development is. It's really, really, really expensive. And as a studio, oftentimes you need some sort of big influx of, your income game. I hate to use this term, but you're kind of your cash cow, whether it is, for Take-Two, it's Grand Theft Auto Online. If for EA, it's EA Sports, most notably probably FIFA now, maybe more so than Madden. 2K, Take-Two really has 2K Sports and GTA Online there. But games like that have these live service long terms, obviously, for Activision here, it's Call of Duty, not to leave that one out of the conversation. But, my point is here that these long-term live service games that are, just making huge amounts of money every month, every year, and that's what's funding all their other projects. And when you don't really, have that kind of game, that can be, detrimental. That could put you in a tough spot. And I think, the more and more that these like huge IPs, get consolidated, and the less room there is for more and more investment, that's not always the best thing here. And obviously, we want to see more and more studios get invested in, bought up in the right way, get invested in to make better and better games with more budget. Of course, that's a good thing on, on one end, but in terms of the larger industry, if and again, I'm no financial expert here, so this is just me talking, I'm not saying this is, anything here is overtly positive or negative, but I do think that obviously as a consumer of games, I want to see more games. I want to see more original ideas and more things invested in that are, given faith to branch out and make new creative ideas. That's, of course, I want to see more investments into, new and creative, cool stuff. I think we all can agree on that. So it's just about here. How exactly do we, keep the competition in the industry fair? How exactly do we keep, new, exciting stuff from coming out? All different types of developers, not just in, one, or two big concentrated markets. If we see deals like this where we don't have, unfortunately, these consolidations of huge libraries of games. Again, it's really a tough issue. I'm not saying I have the answer here either of, this is just, none of this should happen. Again, there's things that do need to happen. The games aren't just, it's not just, it is a business. We do have to, take that into account here. But that being said, hopefully, as I've talked ad nauseum about the Activision deal, hopefully, this, plays out in the best way for the industry, I think. And again, we're just gonna have to wait and see. I feel like I talk about this every week, and I'm looking for a new conclusion here, right? Well, now that this happened, here's my new take on it, and I feel like I've been giving that take over and over. It's gonna be one of those things where we're just gonna have to wait and see. We've been talking about this for a long time, but that being said, hopefully it works out for the best here. I am going to move on, just kind of our last little closing topic for the day here, and that is game sales in 2022. I thought this article was quite interesting, and before I get too deep into the implications of this, I do want to clarify, because I do believe it could be a little misleading just based off the headline. So take this with a grain of salt as I pull this up. But we see here in the headline that this is only in the UK. Keep that in mind. It's still a very, very huge market here. In the UK last year in 2022, digital sales accounted for an estimated 90% of games sold. So again, bear in mind, I just said it might be a little misleading here. At first glance, that's a very, that's a dwarfing number. That really puts like retail sales in a very, very tough spot. We saw a ton of tweets this weekend, saying, is retail gaming dying? Is it dead already? These are huge, huge numbers for digital. That being said, I need to point out here, as I did realize this, that they're looking more into this. This also includes all mobile gaming sales. It includes everything. This isn't just consoles or PC, and that's very, very notable, because mobile gaming is, a huge, huge, huge market. It's the biggest gaming market, and gaming obviously is the biggest entertainment market. So it's the biggest. There's nothing that competes with mobile gaming when you look at it that way. So obviously, seeing that 90% is on digital, almost all mobile gaming. I want to say almost, because I'm not exactly sure, but it should be all. All mobile gaming is done through digital downloads here in terms of this metric. So obviously, it's accounting for a large percentage of this, this statistic here. That being said, they said about 30% of total sales are all mobile sales. So now that you kind of take that into account, the 90% figure, isn't exactly, accurate, but it still is significant. We were looking at about maybe even still like a 60-40-ish split. And forgive me for not doing the math, for not being able to do the math off the top of my head here. I wish they did have that exact conversion of, taking away that 30% of the mobile industry. But I do believe, just again, it's been a long time since I was in math class, guys. Apologies. It still is about like 60-40. I don't want to say 70-30 here, because I'm not sure it's that strong, but it still is about 60-40 digital sales when you're looking at, console retail, physical versus digital, that the main argument you think we'd be talking about here. So really still is a significant benchmark here. It goes to show that, as someone who I love physical disc versions, and even me as the guy who I love having every game on my shelf, my catalog, my collection. But even me, I hate to say it, I've been digital for a long time now. I think I've said it on the show before. It's just the convenience factor of it, having your entire library, one click away or one download away. I'm very fortunate enough to have, decently fast internet that I can live stream here, and, also have the internet going at the same time. So I have decently fast enough internet that I can download games where I think it is worth going digital and not having the clutter and just the hassle of switching out discs back to back, every time you want to switch a game. I know that sounds, maybe tedious to even think of that as a big deal, but when you're in the age of digital and streaming and things like that, I shouldn't say streaming, but like, think TV and other technologies as well, it's tough to tell somebody, hey, you want to have a collection of these DVDs or these VHS tapes or these games, these discs, when you could just have a whole thing that you click a button and it's whatever you want at any moment. There's a few implications there that, I think, unfortunately, as someone, as much as I love physical collections here, it is tough to compete with. And I said before in the past about, my whole conversation on the strengths and the weaknesses of digital here. Of course, the lack of ownership in certain cases here, that, that digital file isn't technically yours. A lot of times you're renting a license. That being said, or you're owning a license, I should say. that being said, it's the same thing with disc games now too. You're paying for that license for that disc to activate on your console. It's not exactly how it used to be, where that disc just has the game, you put it in, it works on anywhere. It does technically, but you're also, if that game goes off the store, if it's unsupported by one of our online services here, sometimes these games don't work anymore, and that's just software, and you can't really do anything about it, regardless of what form or version of the game you have, unless you have some sort of again, this is where discs do come in handy, because sometimes there are versions of games where you can only get that certain version on the disc. But then again, if PlayStation or Xbox or Nintendo said, I just don't want this game running on the server, they can execute files or commands that wouldn't allow certain games to play. So it is something interesting as we get into it. We have been, I shouldn't say get into, have been in the digital age for some time, about how this transition continues. What's the future of game ownership, of media ownership in general, when we move to streaming services and things like that. We've seen this with music in the past, when we moved from streaming back from iTunes and owning your libraries of music and CDs and all the like. So I guess every media industry has to go through a bit of this as we go to the digital age here. But I'm curious to see. Obviously, video games have been at the forefront of being in the digital media since their inception. But again, I digress here. I feel like we're getting back into that digital conversation, but it does seem to be a huge movement here. So it remains to be seen the future of physical games. That was kind of the big conversation here. As you saw in the headline, people were wondering, with that 90% figure being particularly scary, like, do we see all consoles go all digital next generation? Do we see an evolution of what generations are, which I think a lot of people talked about back when the PS5 and Xbox Series X launched, of like, we're just going to see more iterative consoles that aren't full generational leaps, but just new specs, and they all run the same games. We're getting to a point where things are kind of blurring the lines here in terms of console generations, in terms of everything being digital or updatable in certain ways, and obviously hardware always has its its improvements. You can't have ray tracing or something like that on a non RTX there are card. There's always things that are going to continue to improve on the hardware side of things. But that being said, it remains to be seen whether physical gaming and the disc, inputting your disc into a console sense, really survives the next 5-10 years, even. Who knows? It's something that'll be kind of sad to see go. Maybe cartridges come back in a certain way, because they, I think cartridge technology now has improved a bit, where they could probably hold a little bit more than certain discs, but I'm not sure. There's speed concerns. There's a lot going on with the technicals of why they use certain, physical media, but that remains to be seen. Not everybody has the internet speeds here today to be able to just go fully digital. So we're going to see how the internet, providers and services continue to evolve, across many countries and across the world, how gaming continues to evolve. But again, that's about all I have to talk about on those digital sales today. And obviously, as you can tell, that's about all we had to talk about on the show today. So that's about it for our docket. But I do want to thank everyone for joining. In terms of what's coming up next year, we do have I believe we have 1 or 2 game releases coming up either late next week or early the week after. So we'll have more to talk about on the show then in terms of releases. Hopefully some more news next week, but we'll definitely talk about that Xbox Developer Direct when that airs for sure. That'll be very interesting. We'll have some new game trailers, some new fresh video game news to talk about. So that'll be great. But other than that, that about does it for the show today. This is episode 39. So we'll be on episode 40 next week. Bit of a milestone there, almost on the on the road to 50 episodes here. So pretty exciting, but that about does it again. So I digress here. Thank you all for joining today. I really appreciate it as always. Stay tuned to the Endless YouTube channel. All Endless socials. We'll have a lot more in the coming weeks and months, that's for sure, especially what we have going on elsewhere here at Endless. A lot of exciting stuff to share with you guys. So I'm super excited to share everything that's coming up. But that about does it. So thank you all again. I hope you have a great weekend. Enjoy your holiday, and take care. I will see you all on the next Endless Report. Thank you for watching.